Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I thought I'd put on a jacket and try to dress up for this much belated video. This is my top 10 favorite books, top 10 best books that I read in 2022. 2022 was a great reading year for me. I read 62 books, which is the most I've ever read in a year. Now some of those were nonfiction, some were graphic novels, but most were novels, and that's what I'm talking about today here, is just my top 10 favorite novels of 2022. So, without further ado, I'm actually going to start with a couple honorable mentions. So here are my two honorable mentions for 2022. So either of these, feel like they should be on my 2022 top 10 books, but they couldn't quite beat out some of the other ones. So anyway, these are my two honorable mentions. This is Dune Messiah by Frank Herbert. This is the second book in the Dune Chronicles, Dune Saga. I first read this when I was about 14 or 15 and I hated it. I loved the first one and I hated this book because it was so much slower. The first book is about 800 pages and it took me a month to read when I was 14. This one is only about 300 pages and it took me like 4 months to read at the time. But I'm doing a slow reread of the series, and this was one of the first books I read in 2022 and I adored it. I think it's pretty much required reading if you read the first Dune book, because I think this is a perfect companion piece. The first one already has its philosophy, its kind of literary deconstruction, going on, especially around the hero archetype, but this one really hammers it home. This one is much more subdued in terms of plot, but really atmospheric, moody, and very political and philosophical. And then the second honorable mention I will mention for 2022 is Dreams of the Dying by Nicholas Lietzow. This is a huge book. It's a self-published book, and it's even just as a physical book, it's all the more impressive for that because it has, it's really well made. It's got beautiful design work in it. It's got, it's got an appendix about the language and the creatures of the world. So just a very impressive physical book, especially for a self-published book. This is a dark fantasy book that takes place kind of in this archipelago kingdom, and it's a mercenary who was a soldier who's got a very dark past and is dealing with PTSD and depression, and he is hired mysteriously to come work on something in this island, in this archipelago kingdom. This book is, dark fantasy, so there's a lot of horror elements in this book, and I really liked those. I enjoyed those. Specifically, the magic kind of works around nightmares and dreams. So there's a lot of almost Philip K. Dick type things of, what is reality and kind of this blurring of waking and dreaming. The nightmares are very creepy. And what really surprised me about this book was really earnest and I thought valuable conversations about mental health. It really dives into the PTSD, to the anxiety, to the depression that the main character Jaspar is experiencing. It's a fun action, dark fantasy book, but I was surprised at how much depth it kind of had when it came to discussing those themes. So yeah, it's a big book, but if you're into that, if you're willing to put in the time, this is well worth the read. Okay, so now we're starting with the top 10 books of 2022. I haven't really put much thought into, what to say about these books, so I'm just going to kind of briefly ramble about each of them. Starting off with number 10, She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is a kind of fantastical reimagining of, I forget the character, the real life person's name, but essentially it's Mulan, right? It's the Disney story of Mulan, but it's a much darker, grittier and serious retelling than the Disney version, obviously. This is, very kind of historical. It kind of blurs the line between almost historical fiction and fantasy, because the fantastical elements are kind of low. There's not much going on until kind of the end. This is an incredible book. I found myself not really actually enjoying it that much when I was reading it. It was a bit slow. It was a bit kind of opaque and confusing at times, but it's a book that I keep thinking about. It's one that's really lingered in my head, and I keep coming back to it, every month or so, just thinking about different ideas that it presented or different moments, different lines. Essentially it follows a young girl who is fated for nothing while her brother is fated for greatness. And after her brother dies, this isn't really a spoiler, it happens almost immediately, she decides she's going to steal her brother's fate and impersonate him. And this sets her off on a long journey that really explores, ideas of fate and destiny in a really creative way that I'd never really seen before. And it also does some really interesting things exploring gender that I'd never seen before, at least in this type of mainstream fantasy work. So I'm really impressed with this book, and I think there is a sequel coming, and I'm really excited to read it. Number 9, we have Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is kind of a long novella, short novel, and it's my first book that I've read by Adrian Tchaikovsky, who's an author that, based on this book, I want to read a lot of in 2023. So this book is kind of a simple plot, but where it really shines is in the structure. This book is essentially about a young girl, a young woman who's this princess of this kind of small kingdom, and she believes that a demon is stalking her land, so she seeks out the help of a very mysterious ancient sorcerer that lives in this tower that looks over her community. And it's a very simple story, it's a very short story, but the structure is where it really shines, because this book takes place both from her perspective and then each chapter alternates between her perspective and the sorcerer's perspective. And from her perspective, it's a fantasy story, and from the sorcerer's perspective, it's a hard science fiction story. I won't go into any more because I don't want to spoil anything, but it's a really fun book that plays with that genre line between science fiction and fantasy. And yeah, it's also deals with themes of, some mental health stuff, loneliness, depression, anxiety, deals with, ideas of science versus magic, is kind of in a lot of ways, it's really based on that Arthur C. Clarke law of magic, that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. A lot of this book is kind of speaking to that rule or that law. So this was a really fun book, really inventive and creative, and shows you kind of a bit of both genres. Number 8, we have Dracula. This edition never seems to show up very well on camera, but this is Dracula by Bram Stoker. So this is part of my attempt to read some classics, specifically genre classics, right? So this book came out in 1897, I believe, and it held up remarkably well, especially, kind of to what I was thinking. I thought this book would be a bit dated. I thought its prose wouldn't really work for me. I thought its horror wouldn't really work for me. And I was really surprised. This book is funny, it's romantic, it's quite scary at times, like the kind of spooky elements of it really hold up. It's inventive and creative in its structure. This is an epistolary book, so the entire book is structured, is presented to you as a series of excerpts from diaries, journals, newspaper entries, things like that. So yeah, this is a classic of the genre. Vampires are one of my favorite creatures, and I'm really glad I read this. The story is very well known. It's about a young kind of real estate lawyer or broker, Jonathan Harkness, who is sent into the mysterious Transylvania. And it kind of, the book is also an interesting artifact of, late 19th century history as well, in the kind of dwindling of the Ottoman Empire, showing the 19th century imaginary, the borders between East and West in Europe. But yeah, follows Jonathan Harkness going into Transylvania to help a mysterious Count Dracula arrange purchasing land in London, and then kind of follows this macabre tale of Dracula coming to London and Jonathan and a few other people, including mainly his fiancée Mina, having to deal with this. So yeah, great book, really holds up. If you're intimidated by older books, I think this is a great place to start that shows you a lot of where the genre kind of came from. Number 7, we have The Terror by Dan Simmons. This is the third book by Dan Simmons I read, and the first one I liked. I read Hyperion by him, which is kind of a science fiction classic, and I just really couldn't get into it. and I read his first novel, Song of Kali, which I thought was pretty awful. But this book finally landed for me. This is a historical horror novel. Takes place, I believe, in the mid to late 1800s, and follows some British expeditions, like the Franklin expeditions, into the Arctic, like naval expeditions into the Arctic. And it is a really haunting and scary book. Essentially, the horror element on paper comes from a mysterious beast that seems to be hunting the crew as they're kind of stuck and trudging through ice in these ships. But the horror really came through in just the realities of the, expeditions, the cold, the no sunlight, and then the no night, the being stuck in the ice, the kind of mania that emerges from that, and rations going bad, all that stuff. That was where a lot of the horror came through, and it really worked. You can tell that Dan Simmons really did his homework on this book. The types of clothing people wore, the types of technology they used. This is a really well done history book that, even if you took out the kind of supernatural element of this kind of strange mythical beast hunting them, it already would be a thrilling and scary novel. And then with that, it kind of adds another element that is really interesting and fun and dark. The beast is quite scary. It's quite a big book, but it was well paced, right? Like, I was expecting it to be very slow, but I think on the first page or two, it's established that the beast is following them. They're trapped. You understand their situation, and from there it just mounts, and you see the horror of this monster, of the environment, and also of the crew themselves as they kind of descend into kind of worse and worse situations. So finally liked a Dan Simmons book. Number 7, I really recommend. Number 6, we have Magician by Raymond Feist. I don't know if this is cheating or not. These are obviously 2 books, Magician Apprentice and Magician Master by Raymond Feist. These were originally published as one book called Magician, and more recent publications, more recent editions split them into 2 books. So this is the first book, or first 2 books, of the Rift War saga, Raymond Feist's famous Rift War saga, a huge multiple series spanning world, but this is the first of the first series, the Rift War saga, and this was a real surprise for me, and a kind of a surprise hit. It reads very much like classic fantasy. It is young boy, studying magic under a wizard, and he's not very good, but he could be the best, and then mysterious event happens where essentially these invaders from another world come. And it follows this young boy, Pug, as he's studying magic, and he's thrust into this war. And it's him and his friend Thomas specifically, as they kind of grow up in this war and go on very different paths. It's very classic sword and sorcery fantasy in a lot of ways. The prose is that very kind of old-fashioned, high, some people could argue kind of snobby or difficult, but I think it really fit the books really well. But there's a really kind of cool, almost science fiction twist to it in the whole kind of the premise of the Rift War, right? There's these portals that are opening between planets, essentially. So it doesn't really read like science fiction ever, but there is a kind of science fiction idea at its heart, which I thought was really interesting. This is a really fun book. If you're looking for some classic adventure fantasy, highly recommend. And I finished the whole trilogy this year, or quadrilogy if you count these 2, and I loved all of them. So I really recommend the series, and I'm excited to continue on with some of the other books in the bigger series this year. Number 5, 2001: A Space Odyssey by Arthur C. Clarke. This was on my kind of shame list of classic science fiction that I haven't read, which is actually a decent sized list. I like to think I've read a lot of classic science fiction, but you can always read more. And this is one of the big ones that I never read. I'd read some other books by Arthur C. Clarke, and I've loved them. So I thought it was finally time to try this one, and I'm really glad I did. This was written, if I'm getting it correct, kind of in conjunction with the movie, with Stanley Kubrick. So it's really similar to the movie, but it kind of spotlights other things a bit more than the movie, some of a bit less than the movie. So it's definitely got its own focus, and it takes its time on certain things that the movie maybe doesn't. And it's I mean, it's an exciting, thought-provoking science fiction classic. I was really surprised and really enjoyed how much Arthur C. Clarke lingers on that kind of first section of the dawning of man and the kind of our ape ancestors. That was a bigger chunk of the book than I was expecting, and I really enjoyed it. This book has a sense of not quite horror, but kind of dread and foreboding about what's out there and what's kind of, you know, if you've seen the movie or read the book, what these monoliths are. So this book, I think I'm always surprised when books from the kind of 60s hold up as much as they do to a current reader, like a young reader like me. So really thrilled with this book. Yeah, the stuff with Hal, the kind of computer AI that goes a little off its wires a bit, really frightening and yeah, chilling stuff. This book really played with some, I don't think it ever crossed over into horror, but it really was quite chilling at times. So I'm infinitely glad I read this. I highly recommend it, and I'm definitely going to be continuing with this series this year. Number 4, we have The Three-Body Problem by Zhijin Liu. This was on my list for a long time, and then I eventually co-read it with my dad, and I'm so glad I did. This is some modern science fiction at its absolute best. It kind of plays with a lot of ideas like 2001: A Space Odyssey, but this one is, you know, I think a fiercely kind of pessimistic look at humanity and what our first encounter with extraterrestrial life could look like. This is set, or at least it starts, in the kind of background of the Cultural Revolution of China in the 50s and 60s, and it essentially explores, it follows a few characters in a few different timelines, but essentially explores a group of military scientists putting a message out into space to look for intelligent life, and then I don't think it's much of a spoiler, but we find intelligent life, and then the different reactions of the humans and that extraterrestrial life. And yeah, it's a dark book, it's a pessimistic book, and it's a really scientific book in the sense that, you know, it's a hard science fiction book. It focuses on the science, it focuses on the theory, you know, it dives really deeply into a lot of the physics. The name itself is kind of a famous physics problem. The characters are definitely one of the weaker parts. That being said, though, one of the main characters, I believe her name is Ye, I thought was incredibly well done. She's a kind of sympathetic but deeply tragic character that you are not rooting for, but you understand. So that is a common complaint against the series, that the characters aren't well drawn out. I find her, one of the main characters of this first book, to be a big exception to that. And yeah, if you're into idea-based hard science fiction, this is one of the best I've read. Breaking into the top 3, we have number 3, A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. This is, I think, the only book on the list that kind of breaks the genre of the year, right, of science fiction and fantasy. This is contemporary literary novel, literary fiction, that was just such a surprise and joy for me. This is essentially, it follows 2 stories. It follows a young Japanese girl, a teenager in Japan, who has written a diary, essentially a suicide letter, but she decides that before she can kill herself, she needs to chronicle the life of her either her great-grandmother or her great-great-grandmother, I think great-grandmother, I guess, who is a Zen Buddhist nun who had a really interesting life, kind of intertwined with really important historical moments of Japan. So it's that diary, And it follows a woman called Ruth living in Vancouver or Victoria, like in British Columbia in Canada, reading this diary and kind of following along after it's washed up on the shores of British Columbia. This book is, you know, from that premise alone, there's a lot of really heavy, dark, and sad things in this book. But the book is also really funny and light at times, and I've never really read a book that can balance those things as well as this. Like it's not for the faint of heart. It's a really dark book in a lot of ways, but the tone is often so light, and just it's injected with a certain amount of humor that just really works for this book. The grandmother is such a fun, strange, enigmatic character that it's just a joy every time you get to see her. The young Japanese teenager now, whenever you're reading her sections, despite what she's going through, her voice is so bright and energetic. Yeah, this was an incredible book, and it's an author that I now really want to read more of. Yeah, I can't say much more about this without spoiling it, but this is a beautiful book with themes of, yeah, mental health and bullying, themes of kind of midlife crisis, and also kind of ideas of nationalism, specifically in the context of Japan and World War II. Really complex book, and really beautiful. At number 2, we have Jade Legacy by Fonda. This is my fancy Illumicrate edition of this book. So this is the third and final book of the Greenbone saga, which instantly became one of my favorite series of all time. This is, you know, often kind of talked about as the Godfather in a kind of East Asian low fantasy inspired setting. And I think that's a pretty good way to put it. This is a family drama. It's a crime series. It's just so many things. This book is the third book, so I can't really talk much about the plot without spoiling it, but the series in general follows this family who is, you know, they live on this island, and the island is essentially run by different family clans who, you know, provide protection, provide, you know, influence, and kind of are at war with each other, right? At war with other clans. So this follows the No Peak clan, who kind of mostly rules over the main city, Janloon, and the series kind of chronicles the new generation of leadership, the kind of kids growing up into the leaders of this clan, all the problems that comes with, and the kind of growing clan war with another family. But it is just magnificent. The characters are so well drawn out. The action is really exciting. The world is so well realized, and it gets bigger and bigger with every series. On the first book, it really is just that main island, Kekon it's called. And with the second book, you start to see other countries, other continents. And by this book, it's really a world-spanning event. Yeah, incredible book and incredible ending to the series. It really stuck the landing. If you haven't read the Greenbone Saga, I highly recommend it. It's one of the best series I've ever read. Okay, and finally we have my number 1 pick, my favorite book I read in 2022, and this one really came as a surprise to me. So at number 1 we have Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card. This is the second book in the famous Ender series. I read Ender's Game when I was maybe 16 or 17, and I liked it. I should probably reread it because I'm sure it would be better or, you know, more complex as an adult. But I read it and I liked it, but I was never really inspired to kind of carry on with the series. And then I finally picked this up, and it was just magical. It's really incredible. I think if you go into it after reading Ender's Game, expecting more of the same, you're going to be disappointed, frankly, because it's nothing like Ender's Game in a lot of ways. This book takes place thousands of years later, where Ender is still quite young. I think he's about 30 now, after kind of traveling, you know, because of time dilation and interstellar travel, he's managed to stay quite young, but it's about, you know, 1,000 or I think even 3,000 years later. And he is essentially become this really enigmatic figure that no one really knows who he is, called the Speaker for the Dead. No one really knows the Speaker for the Dead is Ender Wiggin. And he essentially travels around working as a speaker for the dead, which is someone who goes and kind of researches the life and death of someone and kind of presents almost a eulogy at their funeral, but a really complex, nuanced eulogy that is supposed to give as accurate a sense of that person's life as possible. And so he ends up coming to this planet, Lusitania, which shows kind of human researchers interacting with the first intelligent alien species since the buggers in the first book. And some of the interactions with this alien species were just incredible. Orson Scott Card said he was really inspired by anthropological science fiction. So a lot of it goes into the kind of the research notes and the kind of, examinations of what these aliens look like, how they act, what their social structures are. And there's essentially a mystery at the heart of this book about something that the aliens do. And I won't spoil it. I do have a review for this book on my channel from 8 or 9 months ago. So check out the review if you want to see more of my thoughts on it. But this is an incredible book. It is atmospheric. It is philosophical. It is emotional. It is tragic. It's uplifting. Yeah, just this was an incredible book that really shows the best that science fiction has to offer, I think. I'm really excited to continue with the series, although I do hear that this is kind of the peak. I hear that, at least for the Ender series, Xenocide and Children of the Mind kind of are weaker than this, but I think I will read them because this was just magnificent. So there you go. Those are my top 10 plus 2 honorable mentions, books of 2022. It was a great year. I'm hoping to read even more this coming year in 2023. And yeah, I'm excited to talk more about some of the great books I read this year. Thanks for checking in, and I'll be back soon, hopefully, with more videos.